Hello and welcome, colleagues and classmates. Thank you for your time and attention this evening. My name is Dr. Jordan E. Montana Richards, and my presentation tonight is on the connections between the learning styles hypothesis and the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. In our quest to identify the connections between the learning styles hypothesis and the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, we will be examining what the learning styles hypothesis is, also referred to as LSH, what its claim is, why it is believed to be popular, what proponents for as well as critics against the LSH have to say, the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, its claim to optimal learning, and its principles of information formatting and presentation, the dual coding hypothesis, as it has a direct relationship to both the learning styles hypothesis and the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. Why student learning attitudes, strategies, and approaches may be the common denominator in differences of student learning outcomes. And lastly, we will summarize our learning styles hypothesis and cognitive theory of multimedia learning connections and draw our conclusions. Let us begin. The learning styles hypothesis is most commonly summarized by Fleming 2001's model for modal learning, called VARK. VARK is an acronym for Visual, Audio, Reading, Writing, and Kinesthetic Modes of Learning. A mode of learning, for example, a visual mode of learning would be learning through observation. An audio mode of learning would be learning or instruction through listening. A reading-writing mode of learning would be Yep, you guessed it. Instruction utilizing reading and writing assignments. A kinesthetic mode of instruction would be to learn by doing, a hands-on project such as building a model rocket or a performance demonstration. Under the learning styles hypothesis, these learning preferences are often determined by learning style assessments and tests. According to Clark and Meyer 2021, as according to the information acquisition theory, which states that 3 ways of delivering the same information is better than 2, especially if 1 or 2 of the routes do not work well for some learners. Therefore, the information acquisition theory predicts that students will learn more deeply from multimedia presentations when redundant on-screen text is included rather than excluded. The claim, according to Dinsmore et al. 2022, that the learning styles hypothesis makes is that individuals can be identified as either visual, oral, or kinesthetic learners, and that when instruction and instructional materials match a student's preferred mode of learning, improved learning outcomes are assured. The modern popularity of the learning styles hypothesis is often attributed to its simplicity, marketability, and beliefs about students. The simplicity of assigning students to different categories of learning, the marketability of education production companies selling the same instructional materials at least 4 different times. The beliefs about students. The essentialist believes that the learning styles are biological and unchanging, while the non-essentialist believes that learning styles are based on tendencies. Lastly, there is the intrinsic desire of the teacher to want to understand and adapt to the individual differences of their students. Proponents of the learning styles hypothesis believe that identifying and matching teaching styles with students' learning preferences or preferred modes of learning, visual, audio, reading, writing, kinesthetic, or a combination thereof, improves student learning. One's preferred learning style is dependent on the results of a learning style assessment or the results of a survey and the responses the student gives. According to Clark and Meyer, the learning styles view in the information acquisition theory which it is built upon is intuitive, but deeper examination is required. Clark and Meyer's major criticism is that the learning styles view in information acquisition theory makes unwarranted assumptions about how people learn. For example, it assumes that people learn by adding information to memory, as if the mind were an empty vessel that needs to be filled with incoming information, such as what we are sort of looking at right now, where each subject would go into the mind as it needs to be filled. Critics of the learning styles hypothesis question the accuracy, validity, and reliability of these learning style assessments by showing that one student learning preference is subject to change and is task dependent, meaning that different learning modes are optimal for different tasks, such as learning to play basketball is indicative of a kinesthetic approach. 2. Case studies testing the learning styles hypothesis claim of matching instruction to student learning preferences reveal insignificant empirical improvements to learning outcomes. Dinsmore et al. And other researchers have showed this. The 18 of the 19 most commonly utilized learning style assessments do not abide by the scholarly psychometric criteria for internal consistency, test-retest reliability, construct validity, and predictive validity. The learning style assessment that does follow the psychometric criteria is the Allison and Hayes Cognitive Style Indicator, and it does not actually measure learning styles, but rather cognitive styles. Lastly, the learning styles hypothesis case studies themselves, most of them, do not follow the scholarly recommendations and guided practices, such as the Pashler model of case study testing. Clark and Meyer, 2021, state that in contrast to the information acquisition view, the cognitive theory of multimedia learning is based on the assumption that 1. All people have two separate channels for processing verbal and pictorial material. 2. Each channel is limited in the amount of processing that can take place at one given time. And 3. Learners actively attempt to build pictorial and verbal models from the presented material and build connections between them. Meyer's cognitive theory of multimedia learning holds that specific multimedia principles can offer ways to reduce extraneous load by removing distracting or irrelevant material through the coherent, signaling, redundancy, spatial, and temporal contiguity principles. Managing intrinsic load by chunking information and defining concepts early through the segmenting, pre-training, and modality principles, and fostering generative processing using scaffolding and pacing through the multimedia personalization, voice, and image principles. Dinsmore et al. 2022 clarifies that the cognitive theory of multimedia learning focuses more on the presentation of the content rather than on the method or mode of delivery. However, research-based presentation and overall instruction often incorporates and leads to multiple modes of, or multimodal VARC delivery methods. The cognitive theory of multimedia learning maintains that optimal learning and instruction occurs when the instruction is designed specifically to reduce extraneous load, manage essential cognitive processing, and foster generative cognitive processing. And the cognitive theory of multimedia learning principles seek to do just that. Reducing extraneous load. Reducing extraneous load refers to extraneous cognitive processing, or ECP, that does not support instructional objectives and is created by poor instructional layout, such as excess text or images. The coherence principle states that instructors should avoid adding any material that does not support the instructional goal. The spatial and temporal contiguity principles state that people learn better when words are spoken and displayed temporally and spatially close in proximity to correlating animations or illustrations. The signaling principle states that people learn better when cues, i.e. content previews, verbal directions such as pay attention here, bolding, highlighting, spotlighting, arrows, and physical pointers direct learners' attention to important and related content within a lesson. The redundancy principle states that people learn better from graphics and narration than from graphics, narration, and on-screen text that duplicates the narration precisely. However, the partial redundancy principle, or boundary, states that repeating key information of spoken information in text form is beneficial, such as information students should take notes on or that they might expect to see on a test. Here is an example of violating the coherence principle. On the topic of the development of apples, we can see an apple tree with dropped apples on the right and some non-specific and almost irrelevant facts about apples. The imagery is not doing much to help with the teaching about the development of apples. The text is mostly irrelevant, and the one piece of text that is relevant is not specific enough. Now, let us examine what it would look like to adhere to the coherence principle as well as the temporal and spatial contiguity principles. First, we notice that the text here is specific. Next, as I discuss the different stages of the apple development, notice the temporal principle, contiguity principle in play, each stage appearing as I mention it. For example, there are 6 stages of an apple's development. Stage 1, Stage 2, Stage 3, Stage 4, Stage 5, and Stage 6. Now, let us examine the spatial contiguity principle, where important text is showcased near in proximity to specific corresponding parts of an illustration. Back to the coherence principle, we can see how each illustration is also very specific and relevant regarding the development of an apple. Let us now examine what a violation of the redundancy principle might look like. Here is an example of violating the redundancy principle. Everything I am speaking, you are reading, even though what I am saying may be important. Facilitating optimal and cognitive processing and optimal learning is more important. Red apples are sweet, green apples are sour. Now, let us examine what redundancy adherence might look like. Here is an example of adhering to the redundancy principle. You are not reading everything that I am speaking, even though what I am saying may be important. Facilitating optimal cognitive processing and optimal learning is more important. Red apples are sweet, green apples are sour. Managing Essential Cognitive Processing, or ECP, refers to managing and reframing complex material that would otherwise overwhelm a learner into a more easy-to-understand framework or presentation through the segmenting, pre-training, and modality principles. The segmenting principle involves breaking content up into bite-sized pieces that are less likely to overwhelm your learners. The pre-training principle refers to a sequencing technique in which the instructor provides explanations of key concepts or interface elements prior to the main part of the lesson. The modality principle states that presenting words as audio instead of text generally results in better learning. Adherence to the pre-training principle would look like this. As you can see, to teach triads or to go further into form and chord progressions of music theory, I would first start by teaching note identification on the treble and bass clefs. Secondly, I would teach intervals, the distance between 2 notes, and scales which are comprised of individual intervals understood as whole and half steps. Finally, I would arrive at building and identifying triad chords and their inversions. From here, my students would have learned the basics needed to understand how to identify and build chord progressions, a series of triads, and the form, musical patterns, and repetitions of a piece. Now, let us examine what violating the segmenting principle might look like. As you can see, well, we are just looking at a block of text, stating a series of tasks. Well, what is wrong with my paragraph of steps? Well, my paragraph could be adhering to the segmenting principle and look something like this, which is more easier to process for my students. They will be able to quickly identify the sections of their assignment and what they must do to complete each section. Now, let us examine what violating the modality principle might look like. Notice, I will not be speaking as the modality principle states that spoken words are often more effective than written words. Therefore, to violate this principle, we would have to conclude that when giving instruction, written words are more effective than spoken words. Okay, class, please observe the information on the screen. Now let us examine what modality adherence might look like. Adherence to the modality principle, which ends up adhering to the partial redundancy principle, may look like this. Apples are good for our health. They provide a number of nutritious benefits. Namely, they contain vitamin C, vitamin K, copper, and potassium. Some studies have shown that apples can help with weight loss. There's a reason they say an apple a day keeps the doctor away. The difference is quite clear. Fostering generative cognitive processing refers to CP, or cognitive processing, aimed at deeper understanding, such as the organization and integration of core material. This deeper understanding is created by the motivation of the learner to make sense of the material they are learning. Fostering deeper understanding can be supported by instructional methods that promote engagement with the core material of a lesson. The multimedia principle states that people learn better from words, spoken or printed, and dynamic or static graphics together than from words alone. The personalization principle states that some people learn better when learning environments, either in person or online, use a conversational, polite, and friendly style of writing or speaking, i.e. first and second person language, for instruction, feedback, and advice. The positivity principle states that people may learn better from when the instructor displays positive emotion through voice and gestures. The generative principle states that people may learn better from being asked to elaborate on the material, such as self-explanations, teach-back assignments, and learner-generated drawings, which leads to the selection, organization, and integration of lesson material, which we call generative processing. The interactivity principle states that people may learn better from playing educational games or simulations. The collaboration principle states that people may learn better from working together, even virtually. According to Guy et al., 2022, the dual coding theory, or hypothesis, states that learners receive and process information simultaneously through two channels, orally or auditorily by hearing, and visually by seeing. Therefore, optimal learning includes animations or illustrations utilized in conjunction with text and/or spoken information. According to the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, each channel can only process so much information at a time before it becomes overloaded. In other words, before an individual is overwhelmed with too much information. Ergo, the cognitive theory of multimedia learning principles, which aim to reduce unnecessary information, focus on important information, and in so doing allow more information to be processed into the long-term memory. While the proponents of the learning styles hypothesis may attribute differing levels of student success to the student's learning style preferences not being met or matched with modal instruction, the critics of the learning styles hypothesis, and even researchers of the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, attribute different levels of student success not to learning style preferences, but to students' background or domain knowledge, interests, motivation, learning strategies, and learning approaches. Researchers attribute 4 domains to student attitudes towards learning. 1. Self-confidence. 2. Value or perceived value of learning the lesson material. 3. Enjoyment from or in participation. And 4. Motivation to participate. Practice opportunities and immediate feedback build self-confidence and contribute to improved learning outcomes. Practical application contributes to perceived value. Enjoyment is linked with motivation. Motivation is linked with retention and student success. Student learning strategies consist of domain general, domain specific, surface level, and deep level. According to Dinsmore et al. 2022, domain general strategies refer to strategies that can be useful in any domain, i.e. concept maps, while domain-specific strategies are those that may only be useful in specific domains, i.e. scientific control of variables. Surface-level strategies, i.e. reading and memorization, help learners understand a problem or reproduce a task, whereas deep-level strategies, i.e. combining text with prior knowledge to gain new insights, help learners transform a problem or task. Schreffler et al. 2019 identify 3 types of learning approaches: deep, strategic, and surface. A deep learning approach is to learn with meaning and recognize underlying principles and connections among related principles. One is studying to understand the material, theories, and their applicability. Other principles of a deep learning approach are seeking meaning, relating ideas, use of evidence, interest in ideas, and monitoring effectiveness. A strategic approach is to adhere to assignment guidelines, rubrics, instructions, and templates, as facilitated by the instructor. Principles of a strategic learning approach consist of organized studying, time management, alertness to assessment demands, and achieving. A surface approach to learning focuses on studying to earn the minimum requirements to succeed and often lacks true engagement. One example of a surface learning approach is to solely study to memorize material for a test. Principles of surface learning include lack of purpose, unrelated memorizing, syllabus focused, and a fear of failure. Among research done in this field, deep and strategic learning are noted to be the most optimal approaches to learn. The learning styles hypothesis maintains 4 individual modes of learning: visual, audio, reading-writing, and kinesthetic, as well as multimodal learning composing of any combination of the 4 modes. Scholars acknowledge that multimodal learning, the process of utilizing different modalities to facilitate learning and active participation, is beneficial, regardless of the student's perceived learning styles, whether they be true or not. The dual coding hypothesis is a visual and audio model promoting learning through 2 input channels, the eyes and the ears. The organization and formatting of lectures and presentation according to the cognitive theory of multimedia learning principles, the coherence, contiguity, signaling, redundancy, segmenting, pre-training, modality, multimedia, personalization, positivity, generative, interactivity, and collaboration principles. Promotes learning through visual, audio, and reading-writing modalities. Facilitating opportunities to practice and apply learned content is a basic principle for good instructional design. These opportunities are primarily kinesthetic and reading writing in nature. However, they may involve all four modalities, VARC. Therefore, when placing the claim that matching a single modality promotes optimal learning outcomes aside, one can understand the connections between the learning styles hypothesis, the dual coding theory, and the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. In summary, while there may be no current case studies demonstrating significant empirical or experimental evidence defined as a standard deviation of 0.5 and above, there are several factors of the learning styles hypothesis that remain inescapably true. The first is that humans are multimodal learners. Humans learn by seeing, visual, hearing, audio, and doing kinesthetic, reading, and writing activities. The second is that scholars from both sides of the learning styles hypothesis debate agree that multimedia and multimodal instruction is proven effective and beneficial. Therefore, a 4-point multimodal instructional design philosophy, incorporating both learning styles hypothesis modalities of learning and cognitive theory of multimedia learning principles, maintains research-based practices for optimal learning. My findings indicated that humans are multimodal learners, maintaining potential to learn equally well from combined modes of learning: visual, audio, reading, writing, and kinesthetic. Therefore, optimal instruction is multimodal instruction, and such instruction that focuses on cognitive theory of multimedia learning principles of instructional design, and instruction that capitalizes on student background, interests, and motivation, attitudes, and facilitates successful learning strategies. My observations include: 1. The connections between multimodal instruction, VARC, dual coding hypothesis, visual audio, lecture and presentation organization and formatting, visual, audio, and reading from the cognitive theory of multimedia learning principles, and practice opportunities, which are kinesthetic, reading, and writing activities. And 2, the connection between developing and capitalizing on student knowledge, learning attitudes, strategies, approaches, interests, motivation with academic success. The implications of these findings reveal a deeper level of understanding of the learning styles hypothesis and its claim and the research involved in attempting to prove this claim. These implications mean that the learning styles hypothesis has not been substantially proven, that multimodal instruction is beneficial, and that educators should seek to develop personal interest, motivation, engagement, proper attitudes, equip their students with properly designed instruction with the CTML principles, and with effective learning strategies. The research findings indicate that there are many avenues for future research in the field of testing the learning styles hypothesis and its claim. Future research may consist of investigating the outcomes of informing students of their accurate assessment-based learning style compared to a purposefully inaccurate assessment-based learning style, and providing these assessment results either before and after instruction, and before and after a learning opportunity or activity. Designing proper learning style assessments and measurements and their instruments that align with the identified psychometric criteria, and large sample case studies with experimental and control groups which align with the Pashler model of the learning styles hypothesis case study testing. My personal research will continue forward with cognitive theory of multimedia principles and applications to digital game-based design, specifically music education games, and more specifically to that of tutorials and feedback, replicating the cognitive theory of multimedia learning principles of presentation, organization, and formatting. My aim will be to test an overarching hypothesis of, can a digital music theory game promote a cycle of intrinsic motivation for students? That is, a desire to do well in the game, which leads to a desire to do well in class, and that doing well in the game promotes learning in class concepts. This cycle aims to develop domain knowledge, personal interests, and ultimately a lifelong involvement in music participation. Thank you all again so much for your time and attention here tonight. I hope you all learned as much as I did throughout my studies on this topic. I bid you all the best of multimodal instruction based on the cognitive theory of multimedia learning principles. Good night, and God bless.